The documentary opens with a bang. The screen trembles to the sound of Wehrmacht engines, panzer tanks advancing like a herd of metallic beasts, devouring miles of dirt road while a cloud of dust rises behind them. The German soldiers, confident, almost arrogant, believed they were writing the final chapter of the war. For them, the Soviet Union was just another announced victim, big on the map, small in resistance. And at first, it seemed true. Soviet cities crumbled one after another. Entire villages were left behind like empty shells, doors still swaying in the wind from recent explosions. Columns of smoke rose on every horizon, marking the path of the German advance like black scars on the earth. The speed of the blitzkrieg impressed even the officers themselves. Each offensive was a decisive blow, each day yielding more territory than any general would dare to promise. Soldiers laughed, joked, pointed at maps, believing they would reach Moscow before Christmas. It was as if they were marching to the beat of triumphant music, until the sky decided to change the melody. First, the air grew heavier, then the wind began to blow icy, scraping against sweaty faces like tiny blades of ice. Dark clouds gathered above the columns of tanks, thick and menacing, as if nature were closing the gates of the promised paradise. And then, in an eerie silence, the first snowflake fell. Small, innocent, but nothing in that war was innocent. The soldiers looked up, some laughed, others frowned. The Russian winter was giving its warning, a warning that echoed in ancient stories, in the legends of the peoples who had survived those lands for centuries. A warning that Napoleon had learned the hard way. The German march, once indomitable, was finding its first sign of the trap. The engines began to sputter, the ground turned to frozen mud, and the hot summer dust transformed into ice crystals that cut through the air. From that moment on, something changed. Not just the atmosphere, but morale. The confidence that had once shone in the soldiers' eyes began to waver. The sky made it clear that rapid, almost arrogant advance was about to be punished. The cold didn't arrive as an attack. It arrived as a silent ambush. In the early days, no one took it seriously. The German soldiers still marched confidently, their boots slapping against the hard ground, trying to ignore the biting wind that insisted on piercing their thin coats. But the temperature plummeted every morning, as if someone were slowly extinguishing the world's heat. At dawn, the scene already looked different. The grass began to sprout, covered in ice crystals. The men's breath came out in dense white clouds, as if each exhalation were a part of their souls escaping. The tanks, once noisy and proud, now had difficulty waking up. The engines creaked, coughed, and were slow to start, as if protesting their survival in that hostile place. And when they did work, they worked badly. The first setbacks began subtly. An entire column of trucks stopped in the middle of nowhere, with desperate drivers blowing hot air into their hands to try and move the frozen parts. At another point along the front, soldiers found their canteens as rigid as stone. The water had turned to pure ice. Every little inconvenience was a warning, but the worst was yet to come. At night, the cold became an invisible enemy. The makeshift barracks offered no protection against the wind, and many soldiers slept huddled together, sharing warmth like cornered animals. Some woke up with stiff purple fingers, others didn't wake up at all. Winter began to choose its victims, one by one, silently. And the scariest part, this wasn't the real winter yet. The officers understood the problem, but tried to maintain morale. "It's just a passing cold spell," they said. "Victory is near. Moscow is just around the corner." The words were nice, but they didn't warm anyone. It was like trying to light a fire with snow. And the feeling on the front lines was clear. Something was wrong, something much bigger than them. The atmosphere seemed alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to truly strike. That was just a whisper. The roar would come soon, and it would be deadly. From this point on, winter ceases to be merely an inconvenience and transforms into a methodical executioner. Everything that kept the German army advancing begins to die, not at the hands of the Soviets, but from the ice. The first signs came from the supply depots. When the trucks finally managed to arrive, after skidding, getting stuck, and nearly tipping over on roads turned into sheets of ice, the soldiers realized that something terrible had happened. The fuel was hardening inside the barrels. It was no longer liquid. It was as if they were transporting blocks of frozen butter. Without fuel, tanks become monuments, beautiful, powerful, and useless. In the camps, the situation was even grimmer. Sacks of food arrived torn, spoiled, rotten from the freezing damp. Potatoes turned to stone, bread as hard as metal, cans exploding because the contents expanded with the ice. Soldiers poked at the food with bayonets, trying to break off pieces to cook. But even the fire seemed to refuse to cooperate in that demonic cold. Hunger began to haunt the ranks. The portable stoves didn't work. The firewood from nearby villages was insufficient, and when they did manage to make a fire, the icy wind extinguished everything in seconds, as if mocking them. Ice had taken hold of the ammunition as well. Cartridges swelled and burst before even reaching the chamber. The oil in the weapons turned to glue. Rifles jammed in the soldier's hand just when he needed them most. German logistics, which had always been the pride of the army, now looked like a bunch of desperate men running around, trying to salvage what could be salvaged, and losing everything. But perhaps the cruelest blow was psychological. Each day, fewer trucks appeared at the supply points, fewer loads, less hope. Hungry men looked at empty roads once teeming with vehicles and wondered, have we been abandoned? A murmur spread through the trenches like a disease. There is no food. There is no fuel. There is no salvation. The army that had crossed continents was now trapped, sitting in snow and starving, waiting for orders that no longer made sense. The German war machine was beginning to freeze. Literally. On paper, the road to Moscow seemed straightforward. Long, open roads cutting through forests and fields. But in real life, Russia had prepared its own secret weapon. It wasn't a tank, it wasn't a general, it was his name. First, the snow fell lightly, accumulating gently. Then, within a few days, it began to plummet as if the sky were collapsing. Large, heavy, endless flakes. It was impossible to see 5 steps ahead. It was like walking inside a darkened world where everything was white and everything was silent. A deadly silence. The roads, once solid, disappeared under mountains of snow. Trucks and tanks tried to move forward and sank as if they were boats being swallowed by the sea. Wheels spun in the void. Tracks slipped. Engines roared and died. The blitzkrieg, that storm of steel that had engulfed Europe in months, now moved slower than a limping man. Soldiers were forced to climb out of the trucks and push them through waist-deep snow, the wind cutting their faces and burning their eyes. Some sank up to their chests into hidden holes and had to be pulled out by their comrades. Every meter felt like a kilometer. Every kilometer felt like an eternity. And all this while they were starving, exhausted, freezing alive. In certain sections, the snow was so deep that the Germans simply gave up and began clearing paths with shovels, as if they had returned to the 19th century. But time was working against them. With each new section cleared, the wind blew and covered everything again, laughing at them, erasing their effort as if it were a cruel joke. It was at that moment that many officers realized the bitter truth. They were no longer advancing towards Moscow. They were fighting to avoid dying along the way. The German columns began to fragment. Units were lost in the storm. Messengers disappeared. Sometimes their frozen bodies were found days later, with the letter still stuck in their stiff glove. The cold not only destroyed German mobility, it destroyed communication, coordination, discipline, and the will to fight. The road to Moscow was not only blocked, she had transformed into a white tomb, waiting for her next victim. While the Germans battled snow, ice, and their own luck, a different wind blew from the Soviet side, a wind of hope. Nature had brought the invaders to their knees, and the Red Army wasted no time. In the first few weeks, the Soviets had retreated desperately, abandoning cities, burning crops, destroying bridges to delay the German machine. It seemed only a matter of time before Moscow fell. But winter, our winter, gave Stalin the most valuable gift of all, time. And time in war is as valuable as ammunition. With the Germans bogged down in the snow, unable to advance, the Soviets reorganized their lines. On the outskirts of Moscow, they began to erect desperate defenses. Men, women, and teenagers took shovels and dug trenches in the rock-hard ground. It was brutal work. With each blow of the shovel, the ground shattered like frozen glass, sending sparks flying and cutting hands, but no one stopped. Civilians joined the soldiers side by side as if they were defending their own home, because that's exactly what they were doing. Moscow's armaments factories worked day and night, with workers sleeping beside smoking machines. Snow seeped in through broken windows, but no one complained. Each rifle produced was a chance to survive. Each tank prepared was a cry of, "We will not give in." And then came the reinforcement that would change everything. The Siberian trope. While the Germans shivered in 10 degrees, these men had been trained in temperatures that would make even ice weep. 30, 40, 50 degrees. Dressed in heavy fur coats, felt boots, and silent white masks, they looked like creatures made of winter itself, and they were rested, prepared, motivated. They didn't come to survive. They came to win. Their arrival transformed the atmosphere. The Soviet soldiers, exhausted from the constant retreat, raised their heads. Timid smiles appeared. For the first time since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, it seemed possible to resist. The German war machine, once as fast as lightning, was now stuck, broken, and vulnerable. The Red Army was gathering forces, sharpening blades, and loading ammunition. And the cold, always by the Russians' side, whispered, "The time is coming." The storm continued to rage across the White Plains when suddenly new silhouettes began to emerge from the snowflakes. Silent, imposing. They moved with an almost supernatural ease, as if the cold were their home. They were the reinforcements Stalin had kept as his secret weapon, the legendary Siberian soldiers. For the Germans, the sight was disturbing. While the Wehrmacht soldiers shivered inside their thin coats, their faces purple and eyes red from the cold, the Siberians walked steadily, like wolves accustomed to the deep snow. They wore layers of thick furs and felt that left them completely white, blending into their surroundings. The expression "felt men" was born there. When the Germans realized that these soldiers looked like silent specters, moving without making a sound on the frozen snow. And they weren't just marching, they were ready to kill. Trained to fight in temperatures that would bring any European to their knees, they handled their weapons as natural extensions of their own bodies. They knew how to walk on ice without sinking. They knew how to set ambushes in frozen forests. They knew how to survive what the Germans called impossible temperatures. But for them, giving up was impossible. In the distance, the Germans watched suspiciously, trying to understand what was emerging from the dark trees. Some thought it was a new German division returning. Others imagined civilians fleeing. But as the silhouettes drew closer, fear took hold. In that deathly silence, only light footsteps and the crunching of snow under Soviet feet could be heard. The Siberians' faces were impassive, almost sculpted. They showed no signs of fatigue. They didn't tremble. Each man seemed more like a living ice statue, advancing with fierce discipline. Unlike the Germans, who improvised clothing with stolen blankets, who tied cloths to their feet to try to avoid freezing, the Siberians seemed made exactly for that battlefield. And then the order came: prepare for the attack. The guns rose in perfect synchrony, hot steam billowing from the barrels like dragon's breath. They advanced, swift as arrows, disappearing and reappearing in the snow, completely confusing the German troops. For many Wehrmacht soldiers, this was the first time they had felt a true pang of terror since the start of the campaign. They were no longer fighting a human enemy. They were facing winter itself, armed and trained, and the Siberians, discreet as shadows, carried with them a silent message. The hunt has begun. German technology collapsing, oil, ice, and the death of the machine, the Wehrmacht, the pinnacle of engineering and military arrogance, marched eastward confident of a swift triumph. The blitzkrieg was the ultimate expression of Teutonic precision, flawless tanks, surgical weapons, logistics that moved with clockwork rhythm. But the East was not a battlefield, it was an abyss of ice, and the Russian winter was not a season, but an ancient and implacable deity awaiting the moment to dismantle German technological arrogance, piece by piece. The collapse began at the heart of the machine, the oil. The German lubricants were thin, summer oils suitable for Central Europe. When temperatures dropped to 30 degrees and beyond, what should have been a vital fluid transformed into a thick, inert black mass with the consistency of petrified tar. Inside the crankcases of the Panzer III and IV tanks, the oil didn't circulate. It sealed the engine. The tanks, once the spearhead of the invasion, became useless steel shells, frozen in place. The mechanics' desperation was a scene of industrial horror. With their bare hands glued to the metal burning from the cold, they attempted the forbidden solution, heating the crankcases with blowtorches. The fire licked the steel, but the thermal shock was fatal. Often, the engine block would crack with a dry, final sound, and the tank was dead forever. The difference was cruel. The Soviets used a kerosene-based winter oil that maintained its fluidity. Europe's most advanced army was being defeated by a failure in the viscosity of a fluid. The betrayal extended to weaponry. The Mauser K98K rifle, with its minuscule engineering tolerances, was perfect for temperate climates. In the cold, the moisture from breath, sweat, melted and refrozen snow all seeped into the bolt. The mechanism jammed. The soldier pulled the trigger and heard only the empty click, a sound that was the very embodiment of despair. The MG-34 machine gun, Hitler's circular saw, fell silent. The internal mechanism, lubricated with summer grease, froze in a fraction of a second. In an act of desperation and desecration, soldiers urinated on the weapons to try to melt the ice, only to see the water freeze again, sealing the mechanism even more definitively, transforming the instrument of war into a block of ice and metal. And logistics, the backbone of the war, disintegrated. The arrogance of the High Command, which believed the war would end before winter, meant that cold weather equipment, fur coats, gloves, felt boots, while existing in depots in Germany, was thousands of kilometers away, trapped in a collapsed supply chain. Only a fraction of the men, perhaps 30%, received adequate equipment. The rest fought in summer woolen uniforms, leather boots that turned to ice, and socks that disintegrated. German technology was not surpassed. It was ridiculed. The Blitzkrieg army was reduced to men fighting with frozen pieces of iron, observed by the Soviets who, in their padded uniforms and with their engine-powered tanks, watched the slow and humiliating suicide of a perfect machine, frozen soldiers standing, the statuary of terror. The cold on the Eastern Front was an executioner that wielded not an axe but silence. It was not a quick death, but a slow and treacherous seduction. Temperatures dropping to 40 degrees created an environment where life was a mistake and death a mechanical inevitability. The first betrayal came from the body itself. Hypothermia was the mistress who promised peace. The body, exhausted by the march, by hunger and by the cold, began to shut down. Blood withdrew from the extremities to protect the core, abandoning the fingers, the feet, the nose and the ears. The result was dry gangrene, a silent terror. Feet, encased in rigid leather boots, lost feeling. The tissue slowly died, transforming into a black, mummified substance that soldiers called charcoal. The horror was the sound, the dry, horrific crack of a toe breaking inside a boot or an ear falling off when touched. Field medics in makeshift shelters performed hundreds of amputations a day without sufficient anesthesia, turning the front lines into a slaughterhouse of limbs. The winter crisis of 1941 to 42 produced more casualties from cold than from enemy fire. But the ultimate horror was death while standing. Overcome by fatigue and the allure of sleep, the soldier leaned against a pine tree or rested on his rifle, seeking a moment of rest. The exhaustion was so profound that his body no longer reacted. In the darkness of the night, the cold acted. With mechanical efficiency, the already sluggish blood stopped flowing. Ice formed in his veins, lungs, and muscle tissue. The man died without a cry, without a spasm, without even falling. At dawn, the patrols would find them. They were human statues, macabre sentinels of despair. Their faces, covered by a thin layer of ice, displayed the last expression of weariness. Or, in more terrifying cases, their eyes remained open, fixed on the grey horizon, silent witnesses to their own extinction. The psychological terror was overwhelming. The enemy was no longer the Soviet, but the very air itself. The men were forced to push the frozen bodies of their comrades stiff as wood to clear them out of the way. The sound of a body breaking as it fell, the snap of a frozen limb snapping, was a constant and visceral reminder that this fate awaited them all. Morale crumbled not under the weight of defeat, but under the weight of the certainty that they were fighting something they could not harm, something that would turn them into ice sculptures, forgotten in the white and indifferent vastness of Russia. With each step in the snow, the German soldier feared not the shot that would come from the front, but the sleep that would come from behind, the silent betrayal of his own body that would transform him into a frozen monument, an eternal warning to anyone who dared to defy General Winter. Despair was the only warmth that remained, a cold flame that consumed the will to fight. The Eastern Front was not a war, it was a ritual of annihilation where cold was the priest and fear the only prayer. The net is closing, the agony of the German pockets. November 1942. Operation Uranus was not just a military maneuver, it was a surgical strangulation. On the 23rd, when the Soviet pincers closed in on Kalak, the 6th Army awoke already dead. It just didn't know it yet. 290,000 men, 100 tanks, 800 cannons, 22 entire divisions, all trapped in a 40 kilometers by 25 kilometer pocket that shrank every hour. Hitler at Wolfschanze shouted on the phone to Paulus, "You stay where you are. Stalingrad will be a fortress, no retreat." Paulus, a staff officer who had never commanded anything larger than a division, simply replied, "Jawohl, mein Führer," and hung up, knowing he had just signed everyone's death warrant. The siege tightened like a snake that doesn't kill all at once. It prefers to suffocate slowly to feel the panic. First, the outer airfields fell. Tatsinskaya on December 24th, Morozovskaya soon after. The Ju-52s that still managed to land at Pitomnik came riddled with holes, pilots with glazed eyes, like those who had flown too much. When Pitomnik fell, on January 16th, there were 8,000 wounded waiting in the hangars. The last planes took off, leaving them behind. Some ran after them, clung to the wheels, were dragged and torn apart by the propellers. Others simply lay down on the runway and waited for the T-34s to pass overhead. The city no longer existed. It was a planet of rubble where every ruin had an owner. The Red October factory was defended by the 79th Infantry Division, men who no longer had the strength to shave, their beards frozen and eyes bloodshot. The grain silo, that concrete monster the Germans had taken in September, was now a vertical tomb. Soviets above, Germans below, separated by floors of corpses. Mamev Kurgan changed hands 14 times in January. Each square meter cost dozens of lives. In the end, the dead were piled up like firewood, because no one had the strength to bury them. At Gumrak, the last airfield within the pocket, the wounded were piled into heaps. As the Soviets approached, the medics injected morphine into the most seriously injured, the entire reserve, and then shot them. A medical captain of the 297th Division wrote in his diary, "I killed 47 of my men today. It was an act of mercy. Tomorrow it will be me." Goering's airlift was the biggest lie of the war. He promised 700 tons a day. At most, 120 arrived. And that was on good days. The crates fell by parachute in Luftwaffe colors and landed on Soviet lines. The soldiers saw the packages floating towards the enemy and screamed with rage, cried and shot at them with their last bullets. One day, an entire shipment of French cognac and decorations fell. Another day, boxes of Red Cross condoms. Yet another, 40,000 second-class iron crosses and 0 grams of bread. Christmas 1942. Inside Kessel was the saddest in German history. In freezing cellars, men sang Stille Nacht in hoarse voices, sharing a can of horse meat between 10. Someone hung a cardboard star on a Christmas tree made of barbed wire. On the 26th, the Soviets attacked exactly where the choir was singing. No one survived. Manstein attempted the impossible with Operation Winter Storm. He reached within 48 kilometers of the perimeter on December 19th, then 35 kilometers, then 12 kilometers. The soldiers in the pocket heard the cannons of the 4th Panzer Army in the distance and went mad with hope. They lit huge bonfires to mark their position. They shouted until they lost their voices. On the 23rd, Manstein received orders from Hitler to stop. He retreated. The silence that followed was worse than any bombardment. A sergeant from the 24th Panzer wrote, "Today we truly died." In January, the 6th Army was split in two, the southern pocket, Stalingrad city, and the northern pocket, factories. Between them lay 30 kilometers of steppe, guarded by Cossacks on horseback. No one crossed. Messengers were sent. With written orders, none returned. Frozen bodies were found with the messages still in their pockets. In recent days, officers burned everything: maps, diaries, photos of brides, letters from children. Portraits of Hitler were used as toilet paper. A colonel from the 71st Division gathered his men and said, "Comrades, it's over. Anyone who wants to can shoot me for believing in the promises." No one shot. Everyone wept. When Paulus surrendered on January 31st, 1943, in the basement of Univermag, he was so weak he could barely stand. He had a kidney infection and was trembling uncontrollably. The Soviets found him curled up on a cot with a Luger pistol beside him, but he didn't have the courage to use it. 2 days later, Strecker in the northern pocket also capitulated. 91,000 ghosts remained. The march began immediately. 38 degrees. Men who hadn't walked for weeks were forced to walk 40 kilometers to the first triage camp. Those who fell were shot or left to freeze. One survivor later recounted, "The road was a black line of bodies. It looked like a dead snake stretched out in the snow. Of the 91,000, only 5,000 returned home in 1955. The rest died of hunger, typhus, forced labor, or simply heartbreak in the Siberian camps." Stalingrad was not a military defeat. It was a deliberate human sacrifice, ordered by a madman 2,000 kilometers away, carried out by officers who chose obedience over saving their men. Hunger, cold, and despair. When the body begins to give up. The winter of 1942-43 was the coldest since 1800. Thermometers registered 42 degrees in January. The steppe wind cut like a butcher's knife. The men of the 6th Army had no winter clothes. Hitler thought the war would end before Christmas. So they wrapped newspapers around their chests, pieces of blanket around their feet, and wore Soviet helmets lined with straw. Nothing helped. Their feet swelled, turned black, and became gangrenous. Doctors cut off toes, feet, entire legs with kitchen knives without anesthesia, while the patient screamed or simply stared at the ceiling. The rations dropped from 300 gree of bread in December to 100 green in January, then 50 gree, then nothing. Horses were eaten down to their hooves, then dogs, cats, rats, frozen birds, then belts, boots, the leather from backpacks, then the dead. Yes, there was cannibalism. These were not isolated cases. In February 1943, the Soviets found basements where arms and legs had been surgically severed. A soldier from the 305th Division was caught cooking a comrade's liver. When questioned, he simply replied, "I wanted to live one more day." He was not punished. There was no punishment possible. The human body can last 40 to 50 days without food, then you start eating yourself. First fat, which they no longer had, then muscles, then organs. Men lost half their weight. A lieutenant who entered the siege weighing 85 kilos came out. Those who came out, weighing 38 kilos. Their ribs looked like clotheslines. Their eyes sank so low that their sockets looked like caves. When someone died, their face froze in an expression of eternal surprise. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, scurvy. The lice were so big you could crush them between your fingernails and hear the crackling sound. Those who caught typhus deliriously cried for days, calling for their mothers in a child's voice. The cellars became open latrines. The smell was so strong it burned your eyes. The doctors did the impossible. A surgeon from the 100th Jaeger Division cut off his own gangrenous leg with a bayonet so as not to delay the others. Another injected gasoline into the wounded to disinfect them when the alcohol ran out. Yet another stitched wounds with thread, taken from Soviet uniforms. But the worst part was their minds. Men who were once proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht now begged for crumbs, weeping. Others laughed incessantly, conversing with the dead. Many simply lay in the snow and waited. A young Austrian soldier wrote to his mother on January 28th, "I am no longer afraid of death. I'm only afraid of continuing to live like this. Tell Dad that I tried to be brave. I failed." Suicides became routine. Those who had bullets kept them for themselves. Those who didn't used bayonets or simply threw themselves into the arms of the Soviets to be shot. An entire regiment of the 297th Division killed itself collectively one night in January. 180 men, one shot each, lined up as if in a parade. When the Soviets entered the basements in February, they found things not even in their worst nightmares. Men who no longer looked human, skins stretched over bones, glazed eyes, some still trying to salute militarily with arms that were nothing but sticks. A Soviet general wrote in his report, "They were no longer soldiers, they were shadows that had once been men." The Sixth Army was not defeated by the Soviets. It was murdered by its own high command, who preferred to let 290,000 men rot alive rather than admit defeat. Stalingrad was the place where the Wehrmacht died from the inside out, not with glory nor with honor, but with an icy silence, a long groan and utter oblivion in the Russian snow. The whispers of surrender. When even the toughest began to waver, January 1943. The air inside Kessel was no longer air. It was a cold poison that burned the lungs and carried the constant smell of rot, feces, and frozen flesh. In the first days of the siege, anyone who dared utter the word surrender was immediately shot for defeatism. Feldgendarmerie officers walked around with ropes around their necks, ready to hang anyone who spoke of capitulating. But now, in the last 3 weeks, the word was no longer forbidden. It was inevitable. It circulated like a silent fever, from cellar to cellar, from trench to trench, like a virus that no doctor could cure. It always started the same way. 2 or 3 men crouched in a dark corner, sharing the last wisp of tobacco or a spoonful of melted snow. The Russians are shouting through loudspeakers that they're going to give us hot food. They said that officers can keep the decorations. I saw Lieutenant Müller leave last night. He only took the woman's photo and left. No one shot him. Paulus will not surrender. He became a marshal the day before yesterday. Do you know what that means? No German marshal has ever surrendered. He prefers that we all die. Then screw Paulus, I'd rather live. On January 8th, General Rokossovsky sent the official ultimatum. Soviet planes flew over the pocket, dropping thousands of leaflets. Surrender and you will live. Keep fighting and you will all die to the last man. The loudspeakers repeated the message in perfect German for hours. Thousands of soldiers listened. Some tore up the leaflets in anger, others kept them in their pockets as if they were passports to life. An entire regiment of the 297th Infantry Division decided to surrender collectively. Loyal officers tried to stop them. They shot 3 sergeants in front of the others. The next day, the entire regiment deserted en masse. The Soviets welcomed them with bread, hot sausage and tea. When the news spread, it was like a spark in a powder keg. Desertions ceased to be isolated cases and became an epidemic. First came the Hiwi, the Russian and Ukrainian auxiliaries, who already hated the Germans. They disappeared at night in groups of 50, 100. They took weapons, maps, even tanks. Then came the wounded who could no longer endure the gangrene-ridden basements. They dragged themselves through the snow with crutches made from broken rifles, hands raised, shouting, "Don't slip, comrade!" Many were machine-gunned by their own comrades, but fewer and fewer, because whoever was shooting knew that tomorrow it would be them. Even the SS began to break down. Men of the 295th Infantry Division found a Sturmbannführer from the Leibstandarte hanged in a cellar with a letter, "I can't stand seeing my boys eat the dead anymore. I prefer hell to that. Heil Hitler" was a lie. Another SS officer from the Totenkopf was caught trying to cross the lines with a white blanket tied to a broomstick. When the soldiers recognized him, they simply lowered their weapons and let him go. No one had the strength to judge anymore. In the final days of the southern pocket, German discipline, that machine of blind obedience that had conquered Europe, simply evaporated. Sentries slept on duty, and no one woke them. Orders were openly ignored. A colonel of the 71st Division gathered what remained of his regiment and said in a hoarse voice, "Comrades, it's over. Whoever wants to stay and die for the Führer, stay. I will surrender tomorrow morning." The next morning, the entire regiment had disappeared, some to the Soviet lines, others to holes in the snow where they lay down to die in peace. Paulus, in the basement of Univermag, received desperate messages from Berlin. "Fight to the last man. The Führer trusts you." He would read them, fold the paper, and throw it into the fire without replying. He was 52 years old, had a high fever, a kidney infection, and trembled uncontrollably. On the night of January 30th, he was promoted to General Feldmarschall. Everyone understood the message. Goering in 1918, Rommel in 1944 would have committed suicide before surrendering. Paulus didn't have the courage. On the morning of the 31st, when the Soviets entered the basement, he was sitting on a cot in his pajamas with his Luger beside him. He didn't touch it. He simply said, in Russian, learned in childhood, "I am Marshal Paulus. I surrender." When news of Paulus's surrender spread through the northern pocket, General Strecker still tried to resist for another 48 hours. But his men had already surrendered in life. Entire regiments raised white flags made of blood-stained sheets. Soldiers emerged from the holes with their hands raised, weeping like children. A captain of the 24th Panzer wrote in the last diary found, "Today I saw an SS man kneeling in the snow, begging the Russians for bread. If even they have broken, what is left of us?" The Sixth Army wasn't defeated by the Soviets. It was defeated from within. It died of shame, of exhaustion, of utter meaninglessness. When the last shot was fired on February 2nd, 1943, most of the men had already surrendered weeks before, in whispers, in the darkness of the basements, when they finally admitted to themselves that they preferred to be called living cowards than dead heroes. The surrender was not a moment. It was a slow, painful, shameful process that began with a whisper and ended with 91,000 glassy-eyed skeletons marching off to Siberia. Winter-breaking men, frozen bodies, shattered minds. The Russian winter didn't kill all at once. It killed slowly, with the patience of a predator, savoring each piece of flesh and each fragment of soul. In January 1943, the thermometer registered 42 degrees C for several consecutive nights. The steppe wind came like blades. Men who had fought in France wearing short-sleeved shirts were now dying with 7 layers of clothing, newspapers wrapped around their chests, pieces of blanket on their feet. Even so, they froze. Sentries were found in the morning still standing, rifle in hand, eyes open covered in ice, mouths frozen in a silent scream. They looked like grotesque statues that winter had sculpted to mock the Wehrmacht. Patrols returned with stories that no one wanted to believe, but everyone believed because they saw it with their own eyes. An entire platoon from the 305th Division was found sitting in a circle, embracing each other, all dead, with expressions of peace on their faces. They had lain down together to share their last warmth and never woke up again. A lieutenant from the 100th Jaeger was found kneeling in the snow, hands raised to the empty sky, as if pleading with planes that never came. A soldier from the 24th Panzer Division dug a hole in the snow, climbed inside, and sealed the entrance with his bare hands. When they found him, he was still breathing. He shouted, "Leave me here, it's warm here." He died 2 hours later. Bodies frozen in impossible positions, arms outstretched, grasping the air, mouths open as if still screaming, bulging eyes fixed on a horror that only they could see. Inside the cellars, the air was so cold that words froze in their mouths. Men would wake up with their dead companions beside them, stiff as wood, and simply push the corpse into a corner because they lacked the strength to carry it. The smell was no longer that of a man, it was that of a dying animal. The hallucinations became so common that no one doubted them anymore. Soldiers saw lights in the distance, warm villages, illuminated windows, smoke rising. They ran there and found only snow. Others heard music, accordions playing songs from home, women's voices calling their names. They followed the sound until they collapsed from exhaustion. A sergeant from the 79th Division wrote on his last day, "My wife came to get me today. She was beautiful in her blue wedding dress. She held out her hand. I ran to her. When I arrived, it was just a T-34 covered in ice. Now I don't know where she is or where I am." Others saw worse things. Ghosts of dead comrades returned to demand answers. "Why are you still alive and I'm not?" Some talked for hours with the dead. Others laughed incessantly, a dry, hysterical laugh that never ended. There were those who tore off their clothes despite the cold, screaming that they were burning. Others curled up in a fetal position and refused to eat even when offered a frozen rat. Their bodies had already given up before their minds. A young Austrian soldier, only 19 years old, was found naked in the snow, dancing. When his comrades reached him, he was smiling and saying, "It's spring, can't you feel it? The flowers are blooming." He died in their arms with that smile frozen on his face. Those who still retained a shred of sanity witnessed even greater horror. Men who were once proud and disciplined now wept like children for a crust of bread. Officers tore up their decorations and threw them into the fire. A major in the 71st Division was seen on all fours in the snow, licking frozen blood from a dead horse. When someone tried to help him, he growled like an animal. Winter didn't need bullets. It only needed to wait for man to look inside himself and see absolute emptiness. When that happened, the body simply lay down in the snow and died. No drama, no last cry of war, just a cold sigh that the wind carried away. When the Soviets entered the last cellars on February the 2nd, they found things no soldier should ever see. Men who no longer recognized their own language, who greeted Heil Hitler in childlike voices, who crawled on all fours, begging for food in Russian, who looked at the victors with empty eyes, as if they had been dead for weeks. Many prisoners died within the first 100 meters outside the dungeons. They simply sat in the snow and closed their eyes with a smile of relief, finally free from the winter that had eaten them alive from the inside, piece by piece, until there was nothing left that could still be called a man. Stalingrad was not a battle. It was the place where the Russian winter revealed the stark truth. Every man has a limit, and the Sixth Army found its limit. In the snow, in the silence, in the utter madness that comes when even hope freezes and dies. The Soviet roar, the revenge that came with the wind. January 10th, 1943, Operation Ring. Rokossovsky didn't send parliamentarians this time. He didn't send ultimatums. He simply gave the order. Finish them off. At 8:05 a.m., the earth trembled, as if the Volga itself had awakened in fury. 7 Soviet armies, more than 280,000 men, 300 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, opened fire simultaneously. There were 55 minutes of uninterrupted bombardment. The sky turned black with smoke even though it was daytime. Snow rose in columns 10, 15 meters high. The German basements where men hid like rats collapsed like houses of cards. Those on the surface simply disappeared, turning into a red mist carried away by the wind. When the bombing stopped, silence fell. That terrible silence that comes before the slaughter. And then, from the midst of the kicked-up snow, they emerged. They weren't soldiers. They were white demons. White camouflage coats, faces covered by balaclavas, eyes that gleamed like burning coals. They advanced in ranks of 200, 300 men, shoulder to shoulder, as if the cold were an old friend. They shouted hurrah with a voice that was not human. It was the voice of all Russia, of all the dead of Moscow, of Leningrad, of Kiev, of Sevastopol, of all the burned villages and raped women and shot children. It was a voice that came from the bowels of the earth. The Germans who still had strength tried to respond, but the MG-42s froze after 3 bursts. The bolts of the Karabiner 98K no longer moved. The oil had turned to glue. The grenades with rods didn't explode because the fuse froze. A sniper from the 305th Division, who had 127 confirmed kills, tried to aim at a Soviet officer. His finger wouldn't obey. It froze, bent on the trigger. The Soviet passed over him and thrust his bayonet into the back of his neck without stopping. At the Red October factory, the last serious stronghold, the Soviets entered singing. Yes, singing. The Internationale, Katyusha, Cossack songs. The Germans, who were still down there, heard the heavy footsteps on the metal stairs and began to cry. A lieutenant of the 295th Division killed himself with the last grenade. He pulled the cord and hugged it to his chest so as not to waste fragments. When the Soviets arrived, they found only pieces of uniform and a pool of frozen blood. In the southern sector, the Soviet 29th Motorized Division advanced 8 kilometers on the first day. 8 kilometers of German territory that no longer existed, only remnants. They found Germans sitting in the snow with their hands in their laps, staring into nothingness. They didn't try to flee. They didn't try to fight. They just waited. A Soviet sergeant asked a prisoner, "Why didn't you shoot?" The German, in a childlike voice, replied in broken Russian, "Because we have no more bullets, and because we have no more reason to." Mamayev Kurgan, that cursed hill that had changed hands so many times that nobody counted anymore, was taken in 3 hours. The Soviets climbed singing, stepping on layers of bodies that formed a crust as hard as stone. At the top, a Red Army captain planted the Soviet flag on the frozen skull of a German officer. He took a picture. The picture went around the world. In Gumrak, the wounded still in the hangars heard the T-34 tanks approaching. Some tried to crawl out. Others asked their comrades to shoot them. A medic from the 100th Jaeger walked among the cots with a Luger and delivered the coup de grace to 63 men. When he ran out of bullets, he used a morphine syringe. When the morphine ran out, he used his hands. When the Soviets entered, he was sitting in a corner covered in blood, singing a lullaby from his childhood in Bavaria. The Soviets didn't stop. They gave no quarter. They shot those who raised their hands because they had no time for prisoners. They only stopped when they saw that the German was so weak he couldn't walk. Then they let him live, because a prisoner who can't walk is better propaganda. A soldier from the Soviet 64th Army wrote home, "Today I killed so many Germans that my bayonet bent. But I feel nothing. I only feel that I'm avenging my mother, my father, my sister, whom they hanged in the square of my village." In 3 days, the southern pocket was cut in half. In 5 days, it was reduced to a third. In 10 days, it no longer existed. The Germans who were still fighting, it was no longer a fight. It was a slaughter, a slow, methodical, cold massacre. The Soviets advanced with flamethrowers, clearing basements with dogs, trained to sniff out Germans hiding in the snow, with loudspeakers playing German funeral marches to mock them. On January 24th, the last airfield, Gumrak, fell. The last He-111s that attempted to land were shot down in mid-air. One of them fell within the perimeter with its belly full of bread and medicine. The Germans rushed towards it like madmen. When they arrived, the Soviets were already there, eating the bread and laughing. When the final assault came on January 30th, there was no longer a front. There were only pockets of dying men. The Soviets entered the basements with flashlights and shouted in German, "Hitler kaputt, Sauerkraut kaputt, komm raus!" And they came out. They came out on their knees, on all fours, crawling, crying, kissing the boots of the Soviet soldiers, begging in Russian, "Tovarish, Kleb, comrade, bread." The Soviet roar wasn't just that of cannons and tanks. It was the roar of an entire people who had been pushed to their limits and were now giving back. With interest, with blood, with 2 years' worth of accumulated hatred, Stalingrad was pure revenge, and Russia collected every last cent. The final break, columns of soldiers dragging their own defeat, February 2nd, 1943. Silence fell over Stalingrad like a shroud. There was no fanfare, there was no final heroic speech, there were no salutes of honor, only the wind howling through the rubble and the sound of 91,000 pairs of boots that no longer marched. They dragged. Columns began to form soon, after Strecker's surrender in the northern pocket. Men who had once paraded proudly down the Champs-Élysées now emerged from the basements like worms from the earth, blinking against the white light, hands raised, faces that were no longer faces. They were skulls with stretched skin, eyes as deep as wells. The Soviets lined them up in rows of 5. Anyone who couldn't walk was shot on the spot or left behind. One soldier from the 297th Division, weighing 42 kilo, tried to stand for 3 days, without eating anything but snow. When the Soviet guard shouted, "Go, go!" he fell to his knees and began to cry. The guard looked at him, spat on the snow, and moved on. He left him there. The man died smiling, finally at peace. The march began. 40, 50 kilometers to the first sorting camps in 35-degree things. No food, no water other than snow sucked from the mud. The men walked like zombies, stumbling over each other, leaving a black trail in the snow. Boots, helmets, pieces of uniform, pieces of people. Every few kilometers, someone would fall. Nobody stopped, nobody helped. Whoever stopped was shot or beaten until they could walk again. A young lieutenant from the 24th Panzer Division saw his best friend fall and tried to carry him on his shoulders. The friend, in an almost inaudible voice, whispered, "Go without me, Karl. I've been dead for weeks." The lieutenant kept walking. He looked back once. His friend was already covered in snow. He had become a small white mound on the road. The Soviets didn't need a heavy escort. They knew no one would escape. Where to? The steppe was endless, the cold absolute. Bodies marked the road like kilometer markers, dozens every kilometer. The road to the camps became known as the Road of the Dead. In some stretches, the bodies formed a continuous line, Germans holding hands, frozen, as if they had tried to warm themselves until the very last second. A prisoner later recounted, "We marched in silence. Nobody spoke. You could only hear the sound of boots in the snow and occasionally the mercy shot of a guard on a fallen comrade. I counted the steps. When I reached 10,000, I stopped counting. It didn't matter anymore. In the first few days, 15,000 died on the march alone. Another 30,000 died in the first 3 months in the camps. Of the 91,000 who left Stalingrad, only 5,000 saw Germany again in 1955, thin, broken, and mute. Many of them never spoke again. Some, when they did speak, only repeated one phrase: I marched. I marched. Those columns weren't of soldiers. They were of ghosts. Ghosts that the Wehrmacht left behind because it couldn't bear to look at its own reflection. For within them was written the truth that Berlin did not want to admit. The invincible machine had rusted. The superior race had frozen. The 1,000-year Reich lasted exactly 1,561 days. And it all ended not with a war cry, but with the sound of 91,000 men dragging their feet through the snow, leaving pieces of themselves with every step, heading towards an oblivion that would last for the rest of their lives. Stalingrad was not just the tomb of the Sixth Army, it was the tomb of German illusion, and those silent columns, dragging themselves westward under the Russian sky, were the funeral procession of the Third Reich. The forced surrender due to the cold, the day winter buried the German war machine. January 31st, 1943, 7:45 a.m., basement of Uniwehrmacht, the last headquarters of the Sixth Army. The thermometer read 30 degrees outside, but inside it felt even colder, the cold that comes from the soul when it has already given up. Friedrich Paulus lay on an iron cot, wrapped in 3 stolen Soviet blankets, with a 4th blanket on top that was actually a dead officer's coat. His face was as grey as cigarette ash, his eyes sunken to the bone. His beard, which had grown for weeks, was no longer a beard. It was a crust of ice and dirt. A kidney infection had been devouring him alive for days. He urinated blood, and a high fever made him delirious. The previous night, exactly at midnight, Hitler had promoted him to General Feldmarschall by radio. The message ended with, "No German marshal has ever surrendered. I trust you will know how to fulfill your duty." Everyone in the basement understood. It was an order to commit suicide. Paulus looked at the Luger on the bedside table, picked it up, put it to his temple, and couldn't. He lowered the weapon. He wept silently. The Reich Marshal didn't even have the courage to die. At 6 a.m., the T-34 tanks of the Soviet 64th Army stopped in front of the Uniwehrmacht. NKVD soldiers disembarked, commanded by Major General Ivan Laskin and Colonel Lukin. They entered the building with flashlights and PPSH machine guns. They went down the stairs. The smell was unbearable. Rot, feces, death. They found Paulus sitting on the cot in striped pajamas. His marshal's uniform was still in his suitcase, never used. Laskin stopped 2 meters away and said in impeccable German, "Herr General Feldmarschall Paulus, on behalf of the Soviet Supreme Command, I demand the unconditional surrender of the Sixth Army." Paulus looked at him as if looking right through him. His voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. "The Sixth Army surrendered a long time ago. Only Mr. Hitler doesn't know it." He signed the paper with a pen that trembled so much the ink smudged. The signature looked like the scribble of a dying man, a crooked, childish scribble. When he handed over the paper, he murmured in Russian, learned in childhood, "Kaput, Weser kaput." At that exact moment, in dozens of basements throughout the city, men began to emerge. It wasn't ordered. It wasn't coordinated. It was something primal, animalistic, like rats escaping from a sinking ship. From the factory of Red October, from the grain silo, from Mamayev Kurgan Hill, from the rubble of the railway station, from the cellars of Red Square, now only red with frozen blood, they emerged. Thousands, tens of thousands, skeletons, in torn uniforms, wrapped in newspapers, blankets, dead horse hides, pieces of carpet. Some without boots, their feet wrapped in frozen rags, black with gangrene. Others without helmets, their hair stuck to their skulls with ice. Eyes that no longer saw, The eyes of the dead who still walked. They came out with their hands raised or with white rags barely tied to broomsticks, or simply empty-handed, staggering, crying. They cried silently because the tears froze before falling, forming small crusts of ice on their cheeks. A sergeant from the 297th Division crawled out on all fours, kissed the snow and said aloud, "Gott sei Dank, es ist vorbei." Thank God, it's over. In the northern sector, Karl Strecker was still holding out. The general of the 11th Army Corps, a Prussian as tough as steel, sent a final radio message at 4:12 a.m. on February the 2nd. The troops fought to the last bullet. Ammunition exhausted, weapons destroyed. Long live Germany. Long live the Führer. Then he destroyed the radio with an axe. At 8:40 a.m., the red flag was hoisted on the tallest chimney of the tractor factory. Strecker emerged from the bunker with his hands on his head. He was 58 years old and looked 90. When offered a chair, he sat down and cried like a child. A Soviet colonel gave him a glass of vodka. He drank it in one gulp and said, "Danke, ich habe schon lange nichts mehr getrunken." Thank you. I haven't drunk in a long time. 91,000 prisoners. 91,000 ghosts. The Soviets began forming columns immediately. There was no ceremony. There was no respect for rank. Marshals, generals, colonels, and privates, all in the same line. A Soviet captain shouted, "Oficeri na pravo, soldati na levo." Officers to the right, soldiers to the left. Paulus was driven, the only privilege. The others walked. The march began at 11 a.m., 38 Tedegzi, biting steppe wind. The men who hadn't walked for weeks due to sheer weakness were now forced to walk 40, 50, 60 kilometers to the sorting. Camps in Beketovka and Krasnoarmeysk. Those who fell were not helped. Those who fell were either shot or left behind. A lieutenant in the 24th Panzer Division saw his company commander fall to his knees in the snow. The old colonel, a hero of France, knight of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, looked at him and said in an almost inaudible voice, "Geh weiter, Junge. Lauf dein Leben. Go on, boy. Run for your life." The lieutenant kept walking. He didn't look back. When he did, the colonel was already a white mound in the snow. The road became a corridor of death, bodies every 10 meters. Some still moved, hands outstretched, pleading for help that never came. Others froze standing like grotesque statues. A group of 40 men sat in a circle, embracing each other, and died like that, together, as if human warmth could still save them. Days later, a single block of ice with 40 faces was found. In the first 7 days of the march, 27,000 died. On the cattle trains that took them to Siberia, another 35,000 died. Doors closed, no heating, no food, just snow sucked from the wagon walls. When the doors opened in Sverdlovsk, Tambov, Karaganda, half the wagons were already empty of living beings, only frozen corpses in fetal positions, embracing each other like lovers. Of the 91,000 who left Stalingrad, only 5,000 returned home in 1955-56. 5,000. Many of them never spoke again. One of them, upon reaching the German border, knelt on the ground, kissed it, wept for hours, and that same night hanged himself in the barracks. He left a note, "I can no longer carry Stalingrad within me." The Soviets felt no mercy. How could they? They had lost 1.1 million men in Stalingrad alone, dead, wounded, frozen, missing. When they looked at those columns of staggering skeletons, they saw the faces of those who burned their villages, raped their women, and shot their children in the mass graves of Babi Yar, Kharkov, and Rostov. A young Soviet lieutenant wrote to his mother, "Mother, today I saw the Germans surrender. They looked like vermin. I felt no hatred. I only felt relief. The revenge was complete, and it was empty. There was no final epic battle. There was no final cavalry charge. There was no farewell speech. The German war machine that brought Paris to its knees in 39 days, that came within 25 kilometers of Moscow, that dreamed of the Caucasus and the oil of the Caspian Sea, died there. He died without glory. He died without heroism. He died crying, trembling, soiling his pants from fear and cold, begging for bread in Russian from the soldiers he still called Untermenschen yesterday. He died because a mad Austrian corporal in Berchtesgaden preferred to sacrifice 300,000 of his men rather than admit defeat. He died because the Russian winter does not forgive arrogance, and when the last column disappeared on the white horizon, under that grey and endless sky of the steppe, the snow began to fall, slow, silent, absolute. It covered tanks. It covered bodies. It covered the dreams of a millennial Reich. It covered Teutonic pride. It covered everything, and in the silence that followed, only the wind could be heard. The wind seemed to be saying in Russian, "You came as conquerors. They'll disappear like dust." Stalingrad was not just the greatest military defeat in history. It was the slowest slaughterhouse ever seen. It was the place where the Russian winter buried alive the myth of German superiority. And from that day on, the Red Army never stopped. He marched over the frozen bones of the Sixth Army all the way to the Reich Chancellery itself. And winter marched with them, always one step ahead, always ruthless, always hungry. Epic conclusion, the blizzard that broke an empire. When the storm finally began to lose its strength, the silence that fell over the Eastern Front was no ordinary silence. It was heavy, almost religious. The snow, once a white curtain that concealed horrors, now revealed what remained of the greatest invasion in history, a frozen landscape where every object, a lost helmet, an ice-encrusted weapon, an overturned tank, told a story. The cameras slowly pan across that dead world. The Germans had arrived there as conquerors, as masters of a war machine that the world believed to be invincible. But what was seen in the end was the complete opposite. They were remnants, fragments, leftovers of an ambition crushed by nature. The narrator explains that the Eastern Front was more than a battle. It was a sentence, a judgment in which the land itself decided the verdict. The cold was no one's ally. The snow didn't respect flags. The wind made no distinction between soldiers and machines. Russia, vast and indifferent, had unleashed its oldest and most ruthless weapon, winter. The survivors of the retreat walked away from that white inferno, unsure if they would return home. Some limped, others were carried, many couldn't even speak. They were men who had seen their colleagues freeze alive, who had fought against the enemy and against the temperature itself, and lost to both. The documentary also shows the Soviets walking among the wreckage. They weren't smiling, they weren't celebrating. Their victory was arduous, marked by the same suffering that had destroyed the invaders. It was a victory that cost burned cities, destroyed families, millions of lives. And then comes the final reflection. The story of Operation Barbarossa is not just a story of tanks, battles, and strategies. It's the story of human arrogance being shattered by the climate, the land, the brutal reality of a country that never allows itself to be dominated. Hitler believed he could crush the Soviet Union in a few months, but he forgot that he wasn't only fighting against soldiers, he was battling the fiercest winter Europe had ever seen in that century. The music gets louder, the images pull back, revealing endless expanses of ice where thousands have lost their lives, and the narration, now slower and more serious, delivers the final sentence, the final blow to the viewer's soul. There in Russia, winter wasn't a season, it was an army, and he was the one who defeated Germany. The screen goes dark, and the viewer is left with the feeling of having witnessed not just a military defeat, but a moment in which nature itself decided the fate of the war.